This episode of the Fight Within podcast is presented to you by Meguiar's. For over 115 years, Meguiar's has been carefully creating and producing advanced formulas with cutting-edge chemistry to deliver a show car perfect appearance. Whether you're showing on the fairway, finalizing your car for auction, or simply getting your beloved car ready for a weekend drive, Meguiar's is ready to help with their premium car care products to make every automotive surface look its absolute best. Meguiar's, reflect your passion. Make sure to visit them at meguiars.com.
What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Fight Within podcast. Today's guest is Mr. Hendre Coetzee. He is an executive coach to the stars. No, I'm kidding. Executive coach, thank you so much for coming on, man. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Ben was telling me how busy you are, so the fact that you made time for us means a lot. So thank you so much. And let's, like I say every episode, let's dive right in and tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you're at, because I think executive coaching isn't a profession that a lot of people are either qualified or want to do at a high level. So just speak on that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Manny. And nice to meet you, Ben. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I mean, executive coaching really, when I started out, wasn't something that you could go to school for. You can now go to school for. You can go to some of the best universities in the world. You can go and study executive coaching as a platform. I'm originally from South Africa. My mother was an immigrant from Holland to there. My dad was there. You know, his family's there multiple generations. And I don't know, right from the beginning, early on, I wanted to help people. I mean, that's kind of just been my default, to want to kind of be in people's worlds and help them out and make the world a better place. I think I got a lot of that from my mom. And yeah, I kind of started out in kind of two worlds. On the one hand, I was a overachiever at school, did well at sports, I did well at academics, and just trying to really engage in everything. My mom had given me this frame of saying, always say yes unless God says or tells you to say no. So I would just say yes to stuff like, oh, do you want to do this? Yes, I'll do that, or I'll try that. And that got me in many dangerous places, because I would say yes to things without thinking about it. I didn't always listen to the things that my mom said. Certainly not. And the other part of me was, kind of involved in church. I was a bit of a rebel kid, and my mom would drag me to church to see if that would work, and maybe we could bump some reality into him or some faith or something. So I was living in these two worlds of saying yes and doing as much, sometimes crazy, and also, really having this deep faith background that introduced me into this idea of, hey, there's something more than just my personal goals. So how do I make a difference, and what's a purpose, and all of those things. So after school, I went to uni, and again, overachiever thing. I was on the student body government, and in South Africa at the time was a major shift. Manny, we were, apartheid was coming to an end. Mandela had been freed from prison. So Mandela was freed in 1990 in February. And so in 1992, they started having the political rallies for the first free elections that were coming up in 94. And because of my role on the student body government, I got to host all of the political leaders who were coming to speak at the school. So I got to meet Mr. Nelson Mandela, as well as all of the other opposition party people, and it was a fascinating exercise in a lot of different things. I mean, growing up in South Africa, I'm a white dude, and growing up during apartheid, there's a lot of things that we didn't know that we didn't know. And then you're confronted with reality, and I think in a lot of the social justice things that we see today. I mean, today's Juneteenth. It's a celebration of the abolition of slavery and all of those things, and that's American context. But South Africa was very different. I was never taught to hate black people, right? We were taught to hate the English, kind of like here. and but the highest form of hatred is indifference, right? And so when you're indifferent to people, that really kind of constitutes things. And so when Mandela came out of prison, we were taught to hate communism, and Mandela was a communist. So when he came to the university, everybody was afraid, like, oh, they're going to change the government, they're going to change all these things. He's a tall dude. He was 6'3". I'm not a tall dude. I'm 5'8" on a good day, 5'9" when nobody's looking. But and meeting him and his way and the way that he operated was really game changing for me. And he asked me my name, he asked me what I was studying, and then he asked me a really interesting question. He asked me, what will be your contribution to the new South Africa? And what was really interesting is, in that question, he invited two things. One, he invited me to be part of something that was in the future, and two, he validated that I had something to offer. And that frame became a big part of how I operated. A couple months later, after all of those political rallies happened, I got a phone call, said, hey, would you like to work for the South African government? And I said, which one? The old one or the new one? They're like, no, new one. And I got some amazing training on how to deal with de-escalation of hostile situations. And we got trained to do a workshop called Unity with Diversity. And we would travel around the country, and and South Africa's got 17 tribes, 11 official languages. It's super complex, right? So there's a lot. It's not just black and white. That certainly is there. But there's a lot of regional things, very, very different tribal things that go on. So I got a massive education really fast. My last name was the same last name as the chief of police during apartheid. So I would walk into a room saying, hey, we're going to talk about unity. And people would be like, not with you.
Yeah.
And so it was really fascinating to learn humility. I got trained in some really great skills in how to manage conflict scenarios, and how to, in a large group of 100 people, we didn't have metal detectors. Sometimes people would come in super weaponed up, angry, frustrated, and with cause, right? And so you say the wrong thing, you have a riot. And a fight is a different thing than a riot, right? A fight, who's coming at you. A riot, it comes from everywhere all the time. It can be chaos. So learning how to manage those things, how to escape a riot, if you have to. I'm not going to tell lies. I had a couple times that we ran, right? Because running sometimes is the better idea, and other times we had to face it. But most of the time we were able to bring people's upset down, help them reflect, and then reframe and find a different way of looking to the future. And that became a foundation for the way I saw my life from that point forward. When I finished university, and because I was kind of like a consultant, if you would, with this government organization, I got recruited to go into politics. I had an opportunity to go into the church. Both of those felt like, no, the church felt like they wanted me to make a commitment for 5 years, which at 22 felt like the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And, politics just didn't suit me. So I was like, well, what do I do? Where do I go? So my mom's an immigrant from Holland, so I decided I was going to go to Holland. Maybe, every young man's dream at 23 is go live in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll do some things, and then I'll come back to the good stuff, right?
Yeah.
I'll go lose myself and find myself.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was in Holland for a few months. I got to work with the missions organizations, how I got there. And pretty soon I was, in Bosnia, helping work with the refugee camp. And somehow life has always had this pull me towards things that are kind of edgy, right? Perhaps a little dangerous, but also really about how do we cause change in an environment where there's a lot of challenge. And so I did that, and for 3 years I lived in Holland, worked with nonprofit organizations, and then worked with non-government things, advising on, transformation, if you would, and everything from advising on hostage situations with missionaries to large scale refugee camp style things, youth organizations, and got more and more involved with entrepreneurs and people who wanted to change the world. More people of my own generation. I had some friends who had moved from South Africa to England. And they were like, "Hey, would you coach us? And would you help us grow our businesses?" And there was one particular event, Manny, that was kind of a life-changing moment for me in my I would say around 24, 25. I'd done all these crazy things and was in dangerous situations, probably one too many a time, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that'll be the end. How do I do different? And I was kind of in a quandary. I'm like, what do I do with my life? So, being a person who believes, I prayed about it. I was like, God, what do you want me to do? And I had this image. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that, where you kind of, like a God moment, like a spiritual thing. You're like, oh, that's pretty intense. So I had this image where I felt like I could either become like David, character in the Bible, or a dude from the Bible history who, he was God's guy, and he, built a temple, and he built this big thing, and he was kind of the main peanut in the packet for a while there. Or I could be like Samuel, and Samuel's job was to find the kings and anoint them, which means to kind of recognize them and validate them and get them on their path. And I felt like, God was saying to me, hey, Hendre, you could either be like King David and you could become a king, or you could be like Samuel and you could find kings and anoint them. And I think everybody wants to be the king.
Sure.
That's kind of how I grew up. Is like, man, be the guy. But when I looked back on my life, I was on the rugby team, but I wasn't the captain. But the captain would ask me advice. I was on the student body government, but I wasn't the president. But I would write the speeches. And I'm a talented guy, and I can lead. Certainly, I've led a lot of people. I've led, a lot of leaders. But I don't wake up in the morning thinking, man, I can't wait to lead people. But what has happened in my life is I have often been sought out by people like, hey, Hendre, what do you think I should do? And it dawned on me in that moment that my destiny, my way, is more the Samuel. My job is to find kings, unlock them, and help them find their path. And I decided to commit to that. And so for the last 20 years, I've had the opportunity to do just that. I mean, there's 1,000 different stories into that, but I moved out of Holland. I moved to London. I got a real job. I'd never had a job in my life. I went to go work for the Virgin Group. I liked adventure, so I liked, Richard Branson and adventure stuff. So I literally looked at the time in a newspaper and like, okay, hey, let me go work with that guy because it seemed like a good idea. The other truth to that was I also went to a bookstore and there was a book called Losing My Virginity. And I was like, that's a great book. I'd been working in military zones and been so deep in church that I hadn't done that yet. I've gone all the way to Amsterdam, hadn't happened. Yeah. And then it wasn't about losing my bloody virginity. It was about starting the Virgin Company.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe it's a sign I need to go. I'll go work with that company. Anyway, I worked with the company and I had a lot of favor. I was, short amount of time. I got to run the little sailors group that I was in, and I realized that the work that I had done in dangerous places, nonprofit, kind of like that, translated into the corporate world, and I could have success there. And I had this nudge that, man, if I could bring light and I could unlock people in places of influence like the corporate world, then that's what I want to do. So, and God and life has given me incredible opportunities. 20 years ago, I moved to the States, or more than 20 years ago, April 4th, 2001. So,
oh, wow.
It's nearly 21 years ago, more than 21 years ago. And it's been an incredible ride. So now I get to work, and there's a lot of history in between, which I'm sure you can ask me about, but I get to work mostly with private equity-backed companies and a couple of publicly traded companies, and I work with their executive teams, so CEO and the top 5 people, and really work around helping them unlock their own performance, individual performance. Sure. And I would say the core of my work is helping people explore uncharted territory, like get to a place where we've never been before, and how do we go that next level. And I have committed myself to master the art of figuring out how do we get to the next level when nobody else has figured out what the next level is.
I think a couple of things that I get from it is how crazy it is that you were in your mid to younger 20s while you were doing all this, and how much life experience that gives you while still going to school and then being involved with government. Is the amount of experience and the type of people you must have been around are a huge asset to what you're doing now, because like you said, it translates to your profession now. But the other thing that sticks out, and you said it twice, was that you committed to something. Can you talk on that, and like why did you choose to commit, or what was it that made you commit? Because I think a lot of people, especially at a young age, are scared of commitment. They're scared to say, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. You had touched on it a little bit, said that the church wanted a 5-year commitment, and you obviously weren't called to that.
No.
But when you did decide to commit to it, what was going through your mind, and kind of how did you make that commitment?
Yeah. It's interesting. I've had a harder time committing to longer term things, knowing the longer term before, like, oh, I know that's going to be 5 years or 10 years. That's a harder commitment to make, so it'll take more time to do. But if I commit, I'm all in, right? Like then I'm in, and I'm going to go for it. And commitment's an interesting thing. I'm sure, maybe I'm going to age myself here, but you've probably seen The Bourne Identity or some of those flicks, right? Or even the Bond flicks. It's interesting in what these guys master in those movies is actually showing what commitment means. Like if you're going to decide a course of action, you can't be tentative about it. You go in, you're all in. Yeah. Like you got to move with that. And commitment to me is not a decision. It's the action that you take on the decision. In a track and field, especially in the 100-meter dash, right? You've got this pose that you got to get into in order to start the thing. You go ready, set, go, right? And most people work on their readiness. But when you're ready, you're just in the starting blocks. It's when you're in the set position, right? When your ass is in the air and all the pressure is on your shoulders so that you could maximum weight and pressure on your legs to go as soon as the gunshot goes. That set position, you're in a committed position, because you have no choice but to respond when the shot fires, right? So you can't control the shot. There are things in life that we can't control. Sometimes the opportunity has to come your way. But most people are in the ready position. They're not in the set position. They're not committed to move when the moment hits. And when the moment hits, you got to take action. You got to go in. And the interesting thing about commitment, Manny, is that commitment generates commitment. It's like momentum, right? Like think about it. If you have a car that's stationary, right, and it's facing the wrong way, and you need to turn it. If it's stationary, you got to take 10 people, pick up the car, and turn it to face a different direction. That car is even if it's facing completely the wrong direction, but if you can get it in motion, you can turn it. So much easier. You can turn it with 2 people, right? Some of your size, you can turn it with 1 guy, right? But it's the key here is that momentum generates momentum, and most people that I find who are not committed are in the decision phase, and they think that if I decide, then I will have momentum. And decision doesn't generate momentum. Decision creates clarity. And clarity is fantastic, but clarity is like this. It's an illusion, right? So I don't know if you've ever had, and I'm sure you have, but when you have these moments of clarity, maybe you're in a movie, or maybe you're listen to a podcast somewhere, and somebody says something, you're like, oh my God, that's me, right? And that clarity moment happens, and it's like, man, lights go on, it feels like a hallelujah moment. You hear a choir sing in the back of your head, you're like, la, this is me. It's an illusion, right? Your brain actually rewards you for understanding where you're at or getting it, right? So you get it. You have a revelation, if you would. Maybe you're in church and you're like, oh man, this is my life. Your brain rewards you with dopamine, right? It's like it's literally you get drugged in the head by your own brain that clarity has changed you. The problem is that dopamine goes away.
Yep.
So your life still sucks 4 minutes later, right? Because now you know, but you haven't done anything, right? And commitment is when you take action on it. And so, again, it goes kind of back to a frame that my mom taught me. It's interesting because I saw her recently and she was like, I can't remember teaching you that. And I'm like, well, that's okay. I'm still going to assign it to you. But say yes unless God tells you to say no. And I think most of us learn no as kids, right? Because you have a parent who tells you, no, don't do this. No, don't do this. No, don't do this. And there's a good part of us as parents that we want to protect our kids. And, even I have a 16-year-old daughter and I get to co-parent with her mom, which is amazing because her mom is a great mom. Her mom is probably more of the no, and certainly is somebody committed to saying yes. But I know as my dad, as her dad, my job is to get her to know how to say yes. Yes to life, yes to adventure, go for it. Now, with measure, right? I don't want her to do crazy, but I don't want her to be afraid. I want her to have courage. And courage is saying yes and taking action on that.
That's so rad. I feel like I just had an aha moment during the podcast.
It's not going to last, don't worry, 4 minutes, man.
Well, no, that because that's where I'm at. We're debating. I'm not debating. My wife is debating moving out of state for various reasons. And I'm like, no, man, we're committed here. Like everything we're doing is here. And so there's sometimes, like last night we went to her dad's house and there's a moment of clarity and I'm like, oh no, like this is what we're doing. We're committed. Here's our plan, blah, blah, blah. Because I was talking to her, I go, we've never had a plan. I go, we've never put together a plan that says, okay, we need to make this much. Like we've thought about it or maybe written a budget, but never like a plan. Like this is what your role's going to be. This is what my role's going to be. And this is how we're going to execute said plan. We've never done that as a couple or as a family. And then it's really funny to kind of veer off on that. My daughter, who's she'll be 11 July 8th. She went and my kids obviously got me a Father's Day card. And, my son's like, oh, Dad, we made memories. Can't wait to make more. Hopefully we can make some today. I'm like, whatever.
Right.
Like, sweet, trying to be nice. 16-year-old kid. My daughter, who's 5, was like, you're the bestest daddy ever. Love you. Cool. And then my 11-year-old wrote me like a paragraph.
Right.
Just saying all these things. And she's like, you've been with me in the highs and the lows, but you always made me feel like I can do anything. So when you said that, I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Like, yes, they can't be fearful. No. And I feel like a lot of times, especially in business, people are fearful because there is doubts. Like if I got in a coffee game and I came to Santa Ana or San Juan and I saw someone like Hidden House, I'd be like, holy crap. Yeah. Like I'm never going to make it. These guys own the market. They have everything. But then when you go on the inside and you see some of the things, because I've learned a lot from Ben when it comes to business and how to just execute certain things and how to pivot and how to focus on very specific things that to master and to see how he is with competition. He no, we're friends. But let's help each other out. Let's grow together. I'll show you how we price things out. I'll show you how we roast. I'll show you. And I'm like, why would you do that? It'd be like, because I come from an athletic background. And so when I go and compete or go fight someone, I'm not going to be like, hey, come to the gym, check out our training camp. And like my game plan, I have to beat you. Like that's what it seems like. But it's so different in the business world because it's like that industry gets bigger.
True, but even in competitive sports, and I realize fighting is the objective of fighting is to beat the opponent. But the true opponent in any sport is injury. Yeah. Right. That's the true opponent. Right. Your inability to be able to fight. Right. Because this is interesting that I think we could learn from Asian culture and Chinese culture, where after a fight, there's a thankfulness, like, oh, even if the person beat you, you're like, thank you for the teaching, like I learned something here today. Because if I don't, and then I'm missing the point. And I think we in Western culture we teach to fight to dominate rather than fight to learn, right? And fight to overcome.
Yeah.
And to me, the greatest opponent is the inability to perform what it is that I'm called to do, right? So if I have competition, they are teachers to me. They're opportunity for me to learn. It's like going to the gym. If there's no resistance in the gym, if I don't have weights or anything like that, even if I have no weights, but I use my body as a way to do it, the resistance is what makes me grow. And so fighting against the resistance, I mean, it's called the fight within, right? So I got to fight some of my own resistance on the inside, right? And that's a part. I want to go back to something you said, Manny, because I want to make sure that I say this and I clarify this. I do believe in plans, and I do believe in having goals. I work with companies and like, for instance, right now we're heading into a recession, and one of the things that we're doing is a frame that we call recalibration, right? So it's gonna, times are gonna get tough, and as they do when there's a recession. So, and companies are interested in increasing revenue, mitigating risk, and reducing cost. And when you have a recession, reducing cost and mitigating risk are primary. You have to always think about revenue. You have no choice, because revenue solves most problems. But you got to mitigate risk and you got to reduce cost. And for that, you need a plan. And so when we go in, we plan. Now, the idea of having a 10-year plan after a pandemic, or a 5-year plan after a pandemic, or how much the world is transforming so fast, feels much harder than before. And so in times of difficulty, we suspend super long-term plans from a business perspective. However, we do need to think about calendar, and especially as a family. My kid is heading into her senior year, and then she goes into college. I want to plan for that. I want to plan to be able to match that, right? And so sometimes the plan is about what are the big events and what are the things that we needed to do. And I will say, in hindsight, I would have looked differently at things about planning, where we were, how we did income, some of those things. I mean, we're very fortunate. I do extremely well, and I'm thankful for that. At the same time, man, I wish I had done some things a little different, and that I could have helped with planning. The problem with a plan sometimes is it feels unclear. And for me, it's easier to commit in the moment than I go and I work really, really, really hard. Let's see what happens. And there's a combination of both, like figuring out the plan. So this recalibration thing that we do with a business, we have a 100-day plan, right? So companies think in quarters, right? So how did we do this quarter versus next quarter? My coach, when I did track and field as a kid, said everybody else runs, I ran the 100, 200, and the 400. And 400 was kind of my main race. And he says, listen, everybody else runs the 400. You run 430. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, because here's what happens. If you run the 400 and you see the finish line, people start letting up right when they see the finish line. And that's where you win the race. You don't run 400, you run 430. And my coach would always stand at the 430 mark. And he says, you don't look at the line, you look at me. And you will run, and you run through the line, and you'll run a second faster than everybody else. Because you look at the end differently. So in business, we don't do 90-day plans. We do 100-day plans because we run through the line. And anyway, just all mind things that we put into a practical application to work at it.
I think it's key, though. A lot of people don't. So we've talked about it before, and we were talking about it off air too, how a lot of the wealthier people that I know, they have the secret sauce, or they don't want to share the secrets. But I think that's what helps not only grow different industries, but that's what helps the listeners. That's what helps us. That's what helps people, is if they know how to do things. Like what's the owner of Virgin? What's his name?
Richard Branson.
Richard Branson. I love one of his quotes where he's like, if you don't know how to do something, say yes and figure it out later.
Exactly.
So the fact that you were talking about, I was like, oh man, that reminded me so much about that quote. Because it is like, I wanted to start this podcast when I first started it for so long. It wasn't until one of my really good friends was like, super Christian guy, pastor, and I'd never heard him cuss ever, and I'm helping him because he's moving out, and renting a motorhome. He has a whole thing. You guys can look him up. It's a Congealier family, and really like easygoing guy. He goes, Manny, you've been talking to me about this for 6 months. He goes, I'm gonna give you the best advice someone gave me, and excuse my French. He goes, just fucking do it. And I was like, you just said a bad word. And that's the first thing I thought of. I didn't even think about what he said. I was like, this dude just cussed in front of me. That's so weird. And he goes, just do it.
Right.
So my first 4 or 5 episodes were literally on the phone. I'd be like, oh, thank you so much for coming on. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah.
And it worked out, and then, things developed. I met Ben. Now we have this badass spot. But it really is. It's just about getting started.
Yeah.
And then I love that you say that commitment, because you might have clarity, but that doesn't mean that you're committed to something, know. And so I don't want to lose just the fact that I'm still baffled by the fact that you were like in your 20s when you were going through all this. I mean, that is insane, because I know when I was at 20, 21, 22, I had a son, but I was such a jackass.
Yeah.
Like I was still like, oh, I'm gonna go be in the NFL. I'm gonna go be an athlete. Like I didn't have my headspace just wasn't there. And I feel like a lot of other countries, the maturity that people have in different countries is a little bit different. It could be because of culture. It could be because of choice.
Yeah, I don't know. Manny, I will say, I didn't know the gravity of the things that I was involved in at the time. Like,
sure.
I met Mr. Mandela, and I was like, okay, that's cool. And then later, in life, I told people, oh, I met Mr. Mandela, and they'd be like, oh my God, you met Mr.
That's
and I'm
crazy.
like,
Yeah.
Was it that cool? Like, it wasn't even that cool in the moment, and it was now in hindsight. So I was probably more ignorant at the time. I really was driven to make a difference, right? I wanted to help people, and listen, I'm sure somewhere there's deep psychology of, if I help people, then I get to avoid myself. There's 1,000 different things that are in there. I don't think it was by any means altruistically perfect or any of that. I was full of crap. So, I don't want to create the illusion that I had incredible clarity. I had drive. I certainly have drive, and I still have drive today. And I think that's it's something that I cultivate. And one of the challenges with having drive is in the past, I've tended to be somebody who runs really, really, really hard until I crash, right? And it's only later in my life now that I've learned the discipline of managing myself more and recognizing the red flags where I'm like, okay, hey, I need to take some time. It's okay to take a rest. Hey, man, even if God could take a rest, I could take a rest, right? Like, okay, so maybe that's okay. And learning to rest well and do that well, and then also manage my drive and push it into directions that will have results. And that also comes from making mistakes. I certainly have made a ton of mistakes in business and in my career.
I think an important thing, though, to kind of highlight what Manny just said, and you too, is obviously I've heard pretty much this whole story before. That's why I've been so quiet and just listening. But it's something that's so unique, I think, because I've had the pleasure of being able to travel the world.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of different cultures. I mean, I didn't grow up in it, but for you, growing up in Africa, South Africa,
Sure.
It's a totally different culture, totally different mindset. And the only thing I wanted to point out in that is people that grow up in America or the Western civilization, they genuinely don't realize how lucky we are here.
Right.
And that's something that's so different. Not saying if you would have grown up in America, you wouldn't have the same drive, because that's obviously within yourself.
Sure.
But situations dictate sometimes who people become.
Yep.
And it's just something to me, especially in today's culture and the climate that we're in. Does America have some massive problems? 1,000%. We do. We're flawed. We're humans. Every single country, every single place that humans are, we're going to be flawed.
Yeah.
But I just want to point out that we are so lucky to live in a place where we didn't have to go through what you went through at the young age that you were at.
Sure.
Our problems here are we have similar issues, but not to the point where I'm afraid to walk outside of my house because I'm going to get shot or mugged. Or do we have that in America? Yes, we do. But as a whole, collectively, we are so blessed to live here, and it just bugs me so much with the climate that we're in right now about America's awful, America this, America that, and that's why I've said it so many times. But to those people, like, leave, go to South Africa, go to Zimbabwe, go to the Congo, go to Ethiopia, go to the Middle East, and see what it's like.
Right.
But I just wanted to point that out because I'm obviously a truly proud American.
Well, it took me a while to become an American, right? And I think having I got to pledge the allegiance and become an American in 2014, and I was very fortunate to do that with a number of veterans who paid a much bigger price to be able to become citizens than I did. Mine was 9 years and $25,000. That's the process that it took to get there, but I got it
crazy,
right. Yeah. But it's an interesting thing that you say, Ben. Let me say a couple things about that. I think it's sad that in America people don't understand the beauty sometimes of what's here. I think when people try to point out legitimate concerns or legitimate things that need to be changed, the consequence sometimes of feedback is how it's received, right? If you give feedback and the objective is to invite people to transformation, that's a wonderful thing. Part of what's challenging in our generation is that people take criticism and turn it into a victim identity. Right? I've had plenty criticism in my life, and part of my job is to give feedback. So I'm responsible for both giving feedback and receiving feedback in that sense. And I do think it's more difficult to grow up today than it was when I grew up, right? Social media creates an alternate reality. And, my daughter and I talk about this. When I grew up, you get asked a question, what's your name? And then what do you do? Or if you're a teenager, what's your name? What do your parents do? You were kind of qualified by, the job your parents had. And there was either shame or pride in that whole deal. Kids today don't grow up that way. They're like, what's your name? And then kids identify through their trauma, right? Oh, I have ADHD, or I have this, or I have that. Like, there's so much language that's been developed for trauma. And I don't want to downplay the trauma, but we've made trauma identity the way that people relate. And so we've created a society of people who relate from a place of being a victim. In order to get attention, in order to get validation, I need to have victimization. And so part of what we've done is we've made being a victim God. It's become idolized. And I don't want to trivialize people's trauma by that. It's Juneteenth again today, and that it's a controversial holiday. But let me think about that. Did people suffer? Is there injustice? Is there things? Is it harder to be from one culture or from one community than a different culture? Absolutely. Do I feel like I have white privilege and all of these things? Certainly, I can recognize that there is some truth to that. And what is also true, and I have a responsibility towards that. And people need to take a look at those things and recognize those things. And I believe a greater underlying danger than any of the oppression that has happened in the past or is happening today is thinking like a victim. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, says the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the oppressed, right? When the victim says, I am no longer going to be a victim, I'm going to rise up. And so there needs to be, I believe, an uprising. But the uprising needs to happen internally first. Let me own my destiny. Let me own my vision. Life is hard. I could tell you my sob story if you want to. I grew up in Africa. Oh, but you were white. Yes, my parents were divorced before I was 1 year old, right? So grew up without money. Everybody's got a story, and everybody's there's always going to be one person who's had a worse experience than you.
Yep.
Right? I remember I was in a refugee camp, and, young, super, zealous and wanting to make a difference, and, ignorant, really, right? And so 800 women and children in there, and part of a missions organization, and I'm gonna share the gospel with them, right? And tell them that God's gonna forgive, and that there's healing available. Until I sat in a room where a woman told me that she'd been gang raped every day by 30 men for more than 2 months. And I'll be honest with you, Ben, Manny, I didn't believe that the gospel that I knew would be enough to heal that memory. Like, I knew spiritually in heaven one day and like that, but I felt like when everybody that I've ever told the good news to came back next week with the same crap problems that they had last week. And I felt like I was going to trivialize her trauma and her pain by sharing this, story of 2,000 years ago, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, I have nothing else to say. I got nothing. I don't know the psychology to help her. There's no trauma counseling or anything like that. So I shared. And the next day she came back, and her face was bright, and she was like, thank you so much for sharing. She says, I don't know if I understand everything what you're saying, but I'm ready to start my life differently today. And that's an interesting thing, right? That frame of, there is oppression. There is incredible pain that's happened. And there's difficulty. In America, there's difficulty, right? You're right. If you want to compare difficulty, let's go to, deep dark Africa, or we go to South America, or different places, or some of the places in America. Difficulty is relative to where you're at, who you're with. And yet, I can have it versus it having me. And I think part of what's pervasive in America is we've idolized being a victim. We've made it such that that's the way to function. And trauma identification is really important in order for healing to happen. Trauma identification, in order for a shift to happen, is also important. And we forget that America, in my opinion, is a promise. It's a promise of an opportunity that if you participate, right? It's the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, pursuit of happiness.
It's the pursuit part that people forget.
Yeah.
They forget that, hey, you know what? There's some work to do.
Yeah, it's not a given happiness.
It's not a given. Even a promise is a possibility, right? That's the promise is there if you work, if you participate, if you contribute. And the way I was introduced to America, Ben, some friends introduced me to a series on personal responsibility and the idea in America of individual ownership of your destiny, meaning that yes, life could hand you a whole bunch of different things to handle, but if you take ownership, if you take responsibility, which is responding to what's in your ability to do, right? And even you got to work on two things. I got to either develop my abilities and I got to develop my response rate. You both are fighters. You guys know that you could have all the great abilities to fight, but if you don't respond, if you're not in the moment, it ain't happening because somebody else has got abilities too, right? So it's responsiveness that needs to work. And I think part of our challenge in America is we are ability focused, so people learn skills. But that response rate, like I'm going to get in, I'm going to engage, I'm going to participate, I'm going to do what I need to do, that part gets hijacked by I'm going to find some way to justify my non-responsiveness. Oh, I have this promise, I could do this. Oh, but you don't understand, Hendre, what I've gone through. You're right, I don't understand. And honestly, in this moment, I'm not going to care as much about it as you do up until now. What I care about is who you could be if you decide to participate. Say yes, engage, manifest, get it done, right? Let's do the work. Let's get to it. Lots of people have potential. Lots. Potential doesn't mean shit, right? When you're young and somebody says to you, hey, you have potential, that's an affirmation. When you're 35 and somebody says to you your potential, they're saying you're bloody lazy.
Yeah.
Don't have potential, have results.
Yeah.
Do the work. And so part of my work is to unlock responsiveness and engagement with people. And I think, our challenge in America is, let's identify trauma. Let's certainly recognize difficulty, challenge, oppression, whatever you, and it's important to call them things. And then what? Right? Then let's unlock the possibility in people. This is why we like the Rocky movies. This is why we love this thing, because it's about coming from behind, being able to rise from the battle. And, there's a real possibility that we don't rise.
I would have said no years ago. Like, I'd say that's impossible, but now I'm not so sure, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, that's a hard reality to face when all the hard work and all the dedication and all the studying, if you will, as an athlete, and when it's still not enough to get the end result that you want. And I think you have to be okay with that. That shouldn't hinder you from pursuing it.
Right.
You also need to be okay with the fact that, like, hey, this might not turn out how you want it to turn out.
Correct.
And I think that's where people get halted. That's where people stop, and they don't say, well, instead of trying to run through the wall, I can get around it this way.
Right. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Right.
Like, change the course, pivot a little bit. I mean, whatever it is. Imagine if every team in the NBA or in hockey just stopped playing when they were down 1-0.
Well, it's because people get paralyzed by fear.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, right? You take about pro athletes, right? So what's fascinating study in America is that more than 80% of pro athletes within the 2 years of finishing their pro career go bankrupt.
Yep.
Right? Because their environment when they were pro was a collective, so they become lonely. 2, they never repurpose their skill into something different, right? And do, like you said, pivot, make that shift. And so I think it's a really important thing to be able to take what you know, pivot it into something different. And I think that's been, part of my journey too. I mean, I lived in South Africa, lived in Holland, lived in England, and now live here, right? And, fortunately it's been 20 years here, and over time I've had to pivot. I mean, I pivot with my kid, right? When my kid was small, I was, together with her mom, we were, kind of protectors. And now, and then I was kind of the policeman, right? I was like, hey, you don't do this, you do this. And now I'm more of a guide, right? And, I'm probably going to turn into a consultant to my kid at some point here. But, I'm like, you got to pay me. But, you have to pivot with the season that you're in. And,
Sure.
What's interesting is when you find pro athletes who learn to take the discipline but change the direction, and keep designing outcomes that they can push towards, they become incredibly successful in business. You can take a look at Charles Barkley or Shaq or some of these guys.
Yeah.
And what they've done is magnificent, right? And I think there's a couple things in there. One is being able to choose a different direction. But also, as much as I've said today, you got to learn to say yes, you also got to learn to say no. And that's important too.
I think, one, I just want to say, again, thank you for taking time to spend with us. But I've had the privilege of being able to spend a lot of time with you and learn from you. And I think I had said it to you in one of our sessions before where I was like, I never, why would I need a coach? Like that mentality. I mean, I clearly needed a coach. I still do. But it's one of those mentalities where I was like, what is this guy going to teach me that I don't know myself or I can't figure out? I've done everything on my own. I've built this. I built that. Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you've said so many things along the journey of me. I think I met you in 2020.
Right.
So 2 years.
Right.
And you helped me.
Feels longer though.
It does.
Yeah.
But you helped me mentally through some of my roughest challenges I've ever experienced in my business career so far. And it's so funny because I've never openly said this, but we've had so many people on the podcast in that chair that you're in right now ask me you always just seem so level and chill, never seen you get stressed with business or anything like that. But they don't realize some of the work that you did with me during that season. I mean, the world was freaking falling apart, right? Personally in business, I was going through stuff that I've never experienced, and that I let the fear paralyze me and cripple me. Right. And I was so stuck where I felt like I was in a quicksand. it didn't matter how hard I fought to get out of it. I was just like sinking and sinking and sinking and suffocating and suffocating. And it's cool now to have you finally come on and like listening to you talk to Manny basically like for that whole time. I was like, dang, like I was recounting in my mind sitting at your kitchen table and like going through some of the stuff that you were saying. I was like, dude, like there's a reason why I was able to finally learn no and finally rest and finally just let go of crap and just be like, whatever, man. Like, I mean, things happen. It's cool. But you helped me personally shift my own mind into so many like different avenues and ways of thinking about stuff that I find is just so important and useful. And that's why I'm like so stoked that you came on today. And I think every person like can learn something from just like sometimes stopping and like resting and letting your mind, like you said, recalibrate, whether you do it on your own or you have someone like you. It's just important to do that because I was the epitome of just go, go, go. Yeah. You know, like I was the yes man. I said yes to everything, like work, family, sports, church, volunteer, giving, whatever. It was always yes, 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 yes. And I ran myself into the ground, went through that experience that you helped me through. And now I'm in just so much better of a place personally, which means I can now offer more to my business, to friendships, to advice. I get a lot of people that ask me for advice now, and I'm like, whoa, it's weird to be in the opposite side. But again, I just want to say thank you. I love listening to it. I mean, I feel like you are such a like naturally gifted communicator. And story, you talk like as if it's a story. Yeah. We've had some people on the podcast that are gifted storytellers, and everything you do, I mean, you've had a lot of years of experience in doing this, but you communicate in a way that makes people be able to be like, oh, that's what that's supposed to mean. Like that aha, you're like, oh shoot, I've heard so many people say a phrase of that, but the way you communicate it it's a gift.
Thank you very much.
And so I just want to say thank you.
Well, it's welcoming too.
Yeah.
It's not like demeaning. Like I never felt like you were talking down to me or talking at me like you were talking.
Not yet, Manny. We'll get there.
Yeah, we need to.
Next time.
I'm down.
But if anyone ever wanted to get a hold of you or find you, we always ask you to like kind of announce like whether it's a social media, a website. Sure. Where could people find you?
Yeah. Thanks. Well, let me just say this first, Ben. Thank you for the privilege, and to be Manny with you guys on your podcast. This is very cool, and it's for sharing about how we got to work together. It takes a lot of guts to take on a coach, I think, and for me, it's always a privilege because I think I get to work with some of the best people, and to me, again, I go back to that my work is to anoint the kings, right, and help them unlock there, and you're one of those, Ben. So for me to be able to help unlock what's there, for me, I work with people often who become much more successful than I am. So you got some work to do.
I'm trying.
No, but you're a magnificent leader, and I love the way you run your business and how committed you are, and so what an honor to get to work with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you could take our website is advancedcoaching.com. It's very simple. Just go there, or you can go to HendreCoetzee.com, which is my website. We need to revamp that a little bit. I'm on social media. You can find the same handles there, and that's kind of how to look for us. Most of the work that I do is based on referral, right? So I focus mostly on corporate. So I work with like I said, private equity companies. I do from time to time, and in certain seasons, go and train people in coaching. I've had the privilege of training a lot of coaches around the world, and so every now and then there's a season where there are people who are like, man, because there's lots of coach training out there.
Yeah.
And they say, hey, I would like to learn how to work with, corporate leaders, and so. Seasonally, I will do that, and I will train some folks in the skills that I know and how to do it, and that's a lot of fun. So,
all right.
Well, awesome, man. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. It was great. I had a good time, and Ben, another great episode.
Yes, sir.
Remember, guys, that everything was impossible till someone did it.
That's right.